My friends, I think a lot of you know that I'm a big sports fan. This was recent, I tried to calculate how many games I've watched in my life, and I gave up because that was a stupid thing to do, and because the number was just too high. But in almost every game I've watched, whether it's Chelsea or the Gators football team or the Final Four bound Gators basketball team, there is always a hard foul that leaves one team screaming for harsh punishment and the other claiming it was an accident. Of course, being an accident has usually very little sort of bearing on whether it was or was not a foul, but it does affect the severity of the punishment given out by the officials. And in a game of inches, in a game that comes down to making your free throws at the end, this sort of gamesmanship can have a real impact. So this week, we read Parashat Vayikra, which means we have finally exited the book of Exodus and entered Leviticus. In the coming weeks, there will be plenty of opportunities for us to talk about offerings and sacrifices and what sorts of things are done with the protuberance of a bull's liver. But this evening, I want to talk about the idea of intention. I find the first 3 chapters of this book of Leviticus interesting in a morbid way. You know, there's only so much discussion of entrails I can really take before I need to move on. But for me, the more important, the more pertinent aspects begin with chapter 4. In Leviticus chapter 4, verse 2, we read, when a person unwittingly incurs guilt in regard to any of Hashem's commandments about things not to be done and does one of them. Then the text goes on to talk about what to do if different groups of people, if the priests offended Hashem's laws, if the community, if you hear that somebody has offended Hashem's laws accidentally. And for me, there are 2 interesting elements here. One is that there is now the realization that perhaps most, if not the vast majority of Israelites, would have been ignorant of some of Hashem's laws and thus deserving of some leniency. Not knowing the laws is not an excuse, but it is sort of a mitigating factor. The other interesting element to me is that later in the Parsha, Hashem acknowledges that not everyone is going to be capable of paying the same fine, of bringing the same offering. If the fine is to sacrifice a sheep, that might be outside someone's financial capability. So they are then instructed to bring 2 turtle doves instead. This tells us that the punishment not only needs to fit the crime, but be proportionate to a person's individual circumstances. Now, every once in a while, one of my kids will say or do something to my wife or to me or to each other that hurts. We can tell it's not on purpose. We can see the immediate remorse in their face, but that doesn't negate the pain. And so we have to talk about how to make amends, how to try to right the situation. It was earlier this week, I don't know how they found this, but they found this plaque. I have it. I was telling people this is a prop for tonight that I got a while ago. And so I guess the story behind it is I edited, my grandpa of blessed memory had written a book when I was, 10, 11, 12 and asked me to edit it. And he gave me this plaque, Jeffrey L. Levin, Chief Editor Extraordinaire. It's little. So, if I was 10, 11, 12, this is, coming up on 30 years ago. And as we're talking about intention, clearly my grandpa could have written me a note, could have sent me a thank you. He might have, but he sent me this instead. And so my kids found this and they were fighting over it. I don't know why. It doesn't do anything. But it sort of brought to mind the idea of making an intentional offering to someone. He could have just given a note, but instead he went and had a plaque made for however 11-year-old Jeff Levin decided to edit his book. Now, in terms of making amends, Hashem, here is talking really about the difference between a sin offering and a guilt offering, which comes when an offense is unintentional. Now, the distinction seems minor. Of course, in Vidui, we talk about both sin and guilt. But I think there's a more positive commandment that is implicit in this that I want to leave you with. I know that all of us in this room too often operate on autopilot. Our interactions with each other are perfunctory. We walk up to a deli counter and say, "How are you doing?" We don't really care how that person is doing, of course. It's just the thing we say. And to be honest, that person's going to say, I'm doing okay. And then you're going to order your meat and it's going to be okay. But I think this idea of intentionality is crucial. Actions that are important require thought. They require energy. They require effort. Little of importance is accomplished by accident. Difficult situations and tough circumstances require people to act deliberately, with thought and with contemplation. And now the variance between punishments Hashem mandates for people who sin accidentally versus on purpose shows us that Judaism really does value this idea of thought. It values people who act with intention, those who confer with others and decide based on good information over ideology. As we move into this next week, the week of Pesach, I want us all to consider how we might act with more intention in our lives, slowing down our decisions and letting reason and rationality be our guides. Shabbat Shalom.